There was a time when 5 invisible kingdoms ruled New York City, not through elections or constitutional authority, but through fear, corruption, and an oath sealed in blood. These kingdoms had no flags, no public offices, no official recognition, yet they controlled the waterfront that fed America's commerce. They decided who could build in the city and who could not. They determined which unions would strike and which would work. They collected tribute from businesses across every borough. They decided who lived and who died. The men who ruled these kingdoms did not appear in newspaper photographs unless they were under arrest. They did not give speeches or seek public office. Most New Yorkers lived their entire lives without knowing their names. But these invisible lords controlled more wealth and wielded more practical power than many elected officials. For decades, they operated with near-complete impunity. Police officers looked the other way. Prosecutors found their cases falling apart as witnesses refused to testify. Judges dismissed charges or handed down lenient sentences. The few government officials who tried to fight this shadow empire found themselves transferred, demoted, or worse. This was not a conspiracy theory or an exaggeration. This was documented reality. 5 criminal organizations, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, had created a confederation so powerful, so entrenched, so protected by silence and fear that it seemed permanent, an alternate government that would outlast the legitimate one. The Federal Bureau of Investigation knew these organizations existed. They had informants, they had surveillance, they had evidence, but they could not break them. Traditional law enforcement methods were useless against an enemy that operated by a code of absolute silence, where betrayal meant certain death, where witnesses disappeared and evidence vanished. Prosecutors would build cases against individual members only to see them walk free. Convict a soldier and another would take his place within hours. Even arrest a boss, and he would continue running his organization from prison through intermediaries. The structure was designed to survive prosecution. Every role was replaceable, except the system itself. For the FBI, it was like fighting shadows. You could see the effects of their power, the violence, the corruption, the control, but you could not strike at the source. The organizations themselves seemed untouchable, protected by layers of insulation, codes of silence, and a legal system that required proof beyond reasonable doubt. But in the early 1980s, something changed. A new legal weapon emerged, one specifically designed to target not individual criminals, but entire criminal organizations. A law that would allow prosecutors to hold bosses accountable for crimes they ordered but never personally committed. A statute that would make the very act of leading a criminal enterprise itself a federal crime. This law was called the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. And in the hands of determined federal prosecutors, it would become the instrument that finally broke the power of the 5 families. The war that followed was not fought with guns, though there was violence. It was fought with wiretaps, informants, and relentless pressure. It was fought in courtrooms where bosses who had ruled for decades suddenly found themselves facing life sentences. It was fought by convincing men who had sworn blood oaths to violate the most sacred rule of their world: never cooperate with law enforcement. This is the story of that war, the story of how the Federal Bureau of Investigation transformed itself from an agency that could barely acknowledge the Mafia's existence into a force that systematically dismantled it. The story of how a single law changed the balance of power between government and organized crime. The story of how the invisible kingdoms that ruled New York for half a century were finally brought down. But to understand the fall, You must first understand what fell. You must understand how 5 families came to control one of the greatest cities on earth. You must understand the structure they built, the code they lived by, and the empire they created in darkness. You must understand that these were not street gangs or loose collections of criminals. These were sophisticated organizations with hierarchies, rules, and systems of governance that rivaled legitimate corporations. They were kingdoms built on violence and silence, and for decades they were absolutely untouchable. Until they were not.
To most Americans in the 1950s and 60s, the idea of a national crime syndicate was the stuff of sensational journalism and Hollywood fiction. Yes, there were gangsters. Yes, there was organized crime. But a national organization? A secret society with strict rules and hierarchies? Surely that was exaggeration. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation from 1924 to 1972, publicly maintained that no such organization existed. He dismissed reports of the Mafia as overblown. He directed FBI resources toward what he considered real threats: communists, political radicals, civil rights leaders. But the Mafia was real. It was organized, and nowhere was it more powerful than in New York City. The structure that came to be known as the 5 families was born from violence and ambition. In 1930 and 1931, New York's Italian criminal organizations fought a brutal internal war called the Castellamarese War. Old world bosses from Sicily clashed with younger, American-born criminals who wanted to modernize and expand their operations. The young reformers won, and from the ashes of that conflict, they built something new. Not a single organization under one boss, but a federation of families, separate but cooperative, independent but bound by common rules. Charles Lucky Luciano, one of the architects of this new order, recognized that constant warfare between criminal groups was bad for business. Competition led to violence. Violence attracted law enforcement attention. Law enforcement attention threatened everyone's profits. The solution was organization. Territory would be divided, disputes would be resolved through negotiation rather than murder, major decisions would require consensus from a commission, a ruling body composed of bosses from the most powerful families. By the late 1930s, this structure had solidified into what became known as the 5 families of New York: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo. These were not the original names. Families were often known by their current boss, but these are the designations that law enforcement would eventually use. Each family controlled specific territories and rackets. The Gambino family dominated the waterfront, controlling the loading and unloading of cargo at New York's ports. This gave them tremendous power over commerce, allowing them to extort shipping companies and control unions. The Genovese family, considered by many to be the most powerful, had extensive interests in labor racketeering, construction, and the garment district. They were known for their sophisticated operations and their insistence on maintaining low profiles. The Lucchese family controlled aspects of the construction industry, waste management, and had significant influence in New Jersey and Long Island. They were smaller than some families, but extremely effective and disciplined. The Bonanno family, named for Joseph Bonanno, who led them for decades, had interests in loan sharking, illegal gambling, and were allegedly heavily involved in narcotics trafficking, though this was officially forbidden by many bosses. The Colombo family was the smallest of the 5, but still powerful, with operations in gambling, loan sharking, and various legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering. But to understand how these families truly functioned, you must understand their structure. This was not chaos, this was bureaucracy. Criminal bureaucracy, but bureaucracy nonetheless. At the top of each family sat the boss, the Don. He held absolute authority over his organization. His word was law. Disobeying the boss meant death.
Questioning his decisions meant death. Betraying him meant not just your death, but potentially the deaths of your family members as well. Below the boss was the underboss, the second in command, who would assume leadership if the boss died or went to prison. The underboss managed day-to-day operations and served as a bridge between the boss and the lower ranks. The consigliere served as advisor and mediator. This was often an older, respected member who provided counsel to the boss and helped resolve disputes within the family. Beneath these leadership positions were the captains, also called capos. Each captain controlled a crew of soldiers, made members who carried out the family's operations. Soldiers ran rackets, collected tribute, enforced discipline, and, when necessary, committed violence. And beneath the soldiers were associates, criminals who worked with the family but were not official members. Associates could be of any ethnicity, though only men of Italian descent could become made members. Associates did much of the actual work, running gambling operations, collecting loan shark payments, moving stolen goods. This pyramid of profit and protection created vast wealth. Money flowed up from associates to soldiers to captains to the boss. Protection and opportunity flowed down. If you were a soldier in good standing, the family would provide lawyers if you were arrested, financial support for your family while you were in prison, and connections that could make you wealthy. But this protection came at a price: absolute loyalty and absolute silence. The code that bound this structure was called omerta, the code of silence. It was not merely a suggestion or tradition, it was the fundamental law that made the five families possible. Omerta meant you never spoke to law enforcement under any circumstances. You never testified in court. You never acknowledged the existence of the organization to outsiders. You resolved all disputes within the family, never through government channels. You accepted punishment, including death, without resistance or complaint. The penalty for violating omerta was death, not a quick death, a death that sent a message. Your body would be found in a public place, often mutilated in specific ways that other members would understand as a warning. Sometimes bodies were never found at all, simply disappeared, the uncertainty itself serving as a deterrent. This code made prosecuting Mafia members impossible. Build a case against a soldier and you would find no witnesses. Victims would claim they saw nothing, knew nothing, remembered nothing. Evidence would disappear. Even members who were clearly present at crimes would maintain absolute denial. Arrest a captain and his soldiers would continue operating as if nothing had happened. Convict a boss and he would run his family from prison through coded messages and intermediaries. The system was designed to be prosecution-proof, and it worked. For decades, it worked brilliantly. The five families generated billions of dollars through their operations. They controlled construction in New York. No major building project happened without the mob taking their cut. They controlled the garment district, determining which companies succeeded and which failed. They controlled waste management, deciding who collected garbage and at what price. They infiltrated labor unions, using union power to extort employers and enrich themselves. The Teamsters, the longshoremen, construction unions, all were compromised to varying degrees. Union pension funds became piggy banks for Mafia investment schemes. They engaged in loan sharking, lending money at exorbitant interest rates and using violence to collect. This was particularly profitable because it required no physical product, no inventory, no overhead beyond the original capital. And despite official prohibitions from many bosses, they became involved in narcotics trafficking. Heroin, cocaine, and later crack cocaine generated such enormous profits that some families could not resist, even though drug trafficking carried severe federal penalties and increased the risk that arrested members would cooperate with law enforcement to avoid life sentences. But the true genius of the five families was not in any single criminal enterprise, it was in corruption. They corrupted police officers who tipped them off to investigations. They corrupted prosecutors who declined to pursue cases. They corrupted judges who handed down lenient sentences or dismissed charges on technical technicalities. They corrupted politicians who passed favorable legislation and blocked reform efforts. This corruption was not crude or obvious, it was systematic. They identified vulnerable officials, those with gambling debts, financial problems, secret vices. They offered favors, gifts, opportunities. They created relationships of mutual dependence where the official could not expose the mafia without exposing himself. By the late 1930s, this structure had solidified into what became known as the Five Families of New York: Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo. These were not the original names. Families were often known by their current boss, but these are the designations that law enforcement would eventually use. By the 1960s, the five families were so entrenched in New York's power structure that they seemed permanent. They had survived decades of periodic law enforcement crackdowns. They had weathered internal conflicts and leadership changes. They had adapted to changing economic conditions and legal environments. They appeared untouchable, invincible, beyond the reach of law.
On October 15, 1970, President Richard Nixon signed into law the Organized Crime Control Act. Buried within this legislation was Title IX, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. At the time, few people understood the revolutionary nature of this statute. It seemed like just another law in an ongoing legislative effort to combat organized crime. Prosecutors were skeptical. Defense attorneys paid little attention. Even the FBI was uncertain how to effectively use it. But RICO would change everything. The brilliance of RICO was that it attacked the fundamental structure of organized crime rather than individual criminal acts. Under traditional law, prosecutors had to prove that a specific person committed a specific crime. If you wanted to convict a mafia boss, you needed evidence that he personally pulled the trigger, personally accepted the bribe, personally transported the drugs. But mafia bosses did not personally commit crimes. They gave orders, they approved operations, they received profits, and they insulated themselves through layers of intermediaries so that their direct involvement could never be proven. RICO eliminated this insulation. Under RICO, prosecutors could charge individuals with racketeering, defined as engaging in a pattern of criminal activity as part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. If you could prove that someone was part of an organization whose purpose was to commit crimes, and that crimes were committed in furtherance of that organization's interests, you could hold them accountable even if you could not prove they personally committed those specific crimes. More importantly, RICO allowed prosecutors to target the organization itself, the enterprise, the family. You could charge the entire leadership structure in a single case, showing how they worked together to commit crimes over an extended period. This was exactly what was needed to fight the five families. But the law alone was not enough. The FBI needed to transform how it approached organized crime investigations. For decades, under J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI had essentially ignored the mafia. Hoover publicly denied its existence and directed resources elsewhere. But after Hoover's death in 1972, the Bureau began to take organized crime seriously. New leadership recognized that the mafia was not a minor problem that local police could handle. It was a national security threat that required federal resources and coordination. The FBI established specialized organized crime task forces. They recruited agents with expertise in financial crimes, wiretap technology, and Italian language and culture. They began building long-term cases rather than seeking quick arrests, and they embraced new investigative techniques that would prove devastatingly effective against the five families. Electronic surveillance became the primary weapon. Previous Mafia prosecutions had failed because of the code of silence. No witnesses would testify. But what if the mafiosi testified against themselves, unknowingly, through their own conversations? The FBI began planting listening devices in Mafia social clubs, restaurants, and even private homes. They bugged cars, they tapped phones, they created a massive archive of recorded conversations where bosses discussed murders, extortion, corruption, and internal family politics. These recordings were pure gold for prosecutors. Defense attorneys could claim witnesses were lying. They could argue evidence was fabricated, but they could not dispute their client's own words, captured on tape, discussing crimes in explicit detail. The most famous of these surveillance operations targeted the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, the headquarters of Gambino family boss John Gotti. The FBI placed listening devices in the club and in an apartment above it. For months, they recorded Gotti and his associates discussing family business. Gotti, who prided himself on his intelligence and caution, was recorded admitting to murders, ordering violence, and discussing criminal operations. His own words would later be used to convict him. But surveillance alone was not enough. The FBI needed something that had been nearly impossible to obtain: cooperating witnesses from within the Mafia itself. For decades, omerta had been absolute. Men went to their deaths rather than cooperate with law enforcement. The few who did cooperate were low-level criminals with limited knowledge. No one of real significance had ever violated the code. That changed in 1963, when Joseph Valachi, a soldier in the Genovese family, became the first made member to publicly testify about La Cosa Nostra. Valachi's testimony before a Senate committee exposed the structure of the five families and confirmed what law enforcement had long suspected. But Valachi was small-time. What the FBI really needed were high-ranking members, captains, underbosses, members of the inner circle who knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. RICO made this possible by creating enormous pressure on arrested Mafia members. Under RICO, racketeering charges carried sentences of up to 20 years per count. Prosecutors could charge defendants with multiple counts, creating potential sentences of hundreds of years. They could also seek asset forfeiture, seizing everything the defendant owned. Faced with spending the rest of their lives in prison and losing everything they had accumulated, some Mafia members made a calculation. The Code of Omerta demanded loyalty, but was the organization showing loyalty to them? When bosses ordered murders of long-serving members to eliminate potential witnesses or settle internal disputes? When families failed to adequately support imprisoned members and their families? When younger members showed disrespect for traditional values? Some decided the code no longer applied. The floodgates opened in the 1980s and 1990s. Soldiers became cooperating witnesses, captains cut deals, and in the most shocking betrayal in Mafia history, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, the underboss of the Gambino family, agreed to testify against his boss, John Gotti. Gravano was not some low-level criminal trying to avoid prison. He was the number 2 man in the most powerful family in New York. He had committed 19 murders by his own admission. He had sworn a blood oath. He had built his entire life around La Cosa Nostra. And he became a government witness. Gravano's testimony destroyed John Gotti, the so-called Teflon Don, who had beaten 3 previous prosecutions. In 1992, Gotti was convicted of murder and racketeering and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He died in prison 10 years later. But Gravano's cooperation had effects far beyond the Gotti case. It demonstrated that even the most loyal, most embedded Mafia members could be turned. It created paranoia within the families. Who else might be cooperating? The code of silence, once absolute, became suspect.
With RICO, wiretaps, and cooperating witnesses, the FBI launched a systematic assault on the five families throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The commission case in 1985 targeted the ruling body of the Mafia itself. Prosecutors charged the bosses of the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families with racketeering, demonstrating that they met regularly to coordinate criminal activities, settle disputes, and maintain the peace between families. This was unprecedented. Previous prosecutions had targeted individual families or even individual members, but this case charged the commission, the governing structure of La Cosa Nostra, as a criminal enterprise. It proved that the five families were not separate organizations, but parts of a larger conspiracy. 8 defendants were convicted, including bosses and underbosses from multiple families. They received sentences ranging from decades to effectively life in prison. The message was clear: even the highest levels of Mafia leadership were not beyond reach. The Windows case in the 1990s targeted the Mafia's control of the window replacement industry in New York. Through labor racketeering and bid rigging, the families had created a cartel that inflated costs and extorted property owners. This case demonstrated how deeply the Mafia had penetrated legitimate business. The Concrete Club case exposed how the families controlled the concrete industry, determining which companies could pour concrete for major construction projects and taking a percentage of every job. This scheme had added millions to the cost of building in New York for decades. Case after case, prosecution after prosecution, the FBI and federal prosecutors dismantled the infrastructure the five families had built over half a century. They convicted bosses, underbosses, and captains. They seized assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They removed Mafia control from unions, industries, and businesses. But perhaps the most important effect of RICO was psychological. For decades, Mafia members had believed they were untouchable. The code of silence would protect them. The organization would take care of them. Even if arrested, skilled lawyers and corrupted officials would ensure they walked free or received minimal sentences.
By the end of the 1990s, the five families that had ruled New York for half a century were shadows of their former power. The systematic application of RICO, combined with aggressive FBI investigations and the collapse of Omerta, had accomplished what decades of traditional law enforcement could not. Entire leadership structures had been imprisoned. Bosses who had ruled for decades died behind bars. Families that had operated sophisticated criminal enterprises found themselves unable to conduct even basic operations without FBI surveillance detecting and disrupting them. The Gambino family, once the most powerful criminal organization in America, was decimated by prosecutions. John Gotti died in prison. His brother Peter was convicted and imprisoned. Leadership passed to increasingly insignificant figures who commanded neither the respect nor the fear of previous generations. The Genovese family, known for its discipline and low profile, suffered similar devastation. Boss after boss was convicted under RICO. The family's extensive labor racketeering operations were exposed and dismantled. Their political connections, once so valuable, could not protect them from federal prosecutors armed with wiretaps and cooperating witnesses. The Lucchese family leadership was virtually eliminated in a series of prosecutions in the 1990s and 2000s. The Bonanno family was so thoroughly penetrated by FBI informants that at one point more of its members were cooperating with law enforcement than remained loyal. The Colombo family collapsed into internal warfare as remaining members fought over what little power and profit remained. But the question must be asked, did RICO and the FBI actually destroy the five families, or did they simply reduce them to manageable levels? The answer is complex. The five families still exist. There are still bosses, captains, and soldiers. There are still criminal operations, illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering on a smaller scale. There are still initiations, still codes, still violence. But the power is gone. The ability to control entire industries, to corrupt government wholesale, to operate with impunity, that is finished. Modern mafia families are constantly monitored by law enforcement. Their communications are surveilled. Their financial transactions are tracked. Any significant criminal activity triggers investigation. More importantly, the culture has changed. The romanticized image of mafia life that once attracted young criminals has been replaced by a reality of constant surveillance, lengthy prison sentences, and routine betrayal. The code of omertà, once sacred, is now routinely violated. Members cooperate with prosecutors to avoid prison time, entering witness protection and testifying against former associates with little apparent shame. The younger generation shows neither the discipline nor the commitment of their predecessors. They are more likely to use drugs, to talk carelessly, to engage in violence that attracts attention rather than advancing organizational interests. The sophisticated criminals who built the five families into billion-dollar enterprises have been replaced by lesser men managing declining operations. What remains is largely symbolic. The five families are names that carry historical weight but diminished contemporary power. They still commit crimes, still generate income, still occasionally resort to violence, but they are no longer invisible kingdoms ruling from the shadows. They are criminal organizations under constant scrutiny, their every move monitored, their leadership depleted, their power broken. The legacy of RICO extends far beyond the five families. The statute has been used against drug cartels, street gangs, corrupt police departments, and even legitimate corporations engaged in systematic criminal activity. It has become one of the most powerful tools in federal law enforcement, allowing prosecutors to target not just individual criminals, but entire criminal enterprises. The investigative techniques pioneered against the Mafia, long-term surveillance, financial analysis, cooperation agreements, coordinated multi-agency efforts, have become standard practice in fighting all forms of organized crime. And the psychological lesson is clear. No criminal organization, regardless of how powerful or entrenched, can survive when its fundamental code is broken. Omertà made the five families possible. When omertà collapsed, the families fell with it. The story of the FBI, RICO, and the fall of the five families is ultimately a story about the limits and possibilities of law enforcement in a democratic society. For decades, it appeared that the five families were too powerful to touch, too well organized to penetrate, too protected by silence and fear to prosecute. They controlled industries worth billions. They corrupted democratic institutions. They operated with such impunity that they seemed to represent an alternative form of government, one based not on the consent of the governed, but on the silence of the terrified. RICO proved that even such organizations could be defeated, not through matching their violence or abandoning legal principles, but through creative application of law, patient investigation, and relentless pressure. The invisible kingdoms fell. The lords who ruled them died in prison or live out their final years under constant surveillance. The code that bound them together shattered. The empire built on blood and silence was dismantled by law and testimony. But the story is not entirely finished. The five families still exist in diminished form. New criminal organizations emerge to fill vacuums left by the Mafia's decline. The impulse towards organized crime, the desire for power, wealth, and control outside legal structures remains a constant in human society. What the fall of the five families demonstrates is not that organized crime can be eliminated, but that it can be controlled, that even the most powerful criminal organizations are not invincible, that law, properly applied with sufficient resources and political will, can prevail over violence and corruption. The lords of the five families believed they had built something permanent, an alternative power structure that would outlast governments and laws. They were wrong. Their kingdoms have fallen. their legacy remains primarily as a historical cautionary tale about the limits of power built on fear and the inevitable collapse of institutions that depend on absolute silence. The FBI won, RICO worked, the 5 families fell. And in courtrooms, on surveillance tapes, and in the testimony of former members who violated Omerta, the invisible empire became visible, vulnerable, and ultimately defeated.